Brainbox podcast. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that brings humanities scholarship to the general public. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. Brainbox is a podcast for your noggin. It's meant to challenge our guests to make the humanities relevant to current issues and challenge listeners to use their brainbox to make better sense of the human experience. We talk to experts in humanities fields like history, philosophy, literature, and ethics who give informed views on the deeper historical and cultural contexts of world events. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard, and you can also find all of our previous episodes by going to our website, okhumanities.org/brainbox, and on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting libraries. And you can email comments and questions to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Underwriting support for this episode of Brainbox is provided by The Springer Company, an Oklahoma company specializing in payroll and bookkeeping for small employers, nonprofits, and local government agencies. For more information, visit thespringercompany.com. In this episode, we'll be talking about the intersection of the environment and the humanities and the concept of environmental ethics. Our guest is the Reverend Dr. Mark Y.A. Davies. Mark is the Wimberly Professor of Social and Ecological Ethics and the Director of the World House Institute for Social and Ecological Responsibility at Oklahoma City University. He's worked in both teaching and administration at OCU for 23 years. Mark is an ordained elder in the Oklahoma Conference of the United Methodist Church, where he has served as chair of the Board of Church and Society from 2015 to 2018. He's also currently the Oklahoma Humanities State Scholar for our newest Smithsonian Museum on Main Street traveling exhibition, which is called Waterways. We'll talk about that later in the episode. Mark's PhD is from Boston University in the area of social ethics. His teaching and research focus on the issues of environmental ethics, social ethics, interfaith cooperation, and ecological sustainability. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. I wanted to jump right in and talk about the term environmental ethics. How do you define that term?
Well, let's start with the term ethics, and that would be, the most simple definition would be thinking about morality. And what I mean by morality is the actual experience of making decisions about what's right, what's wrong, what we value, what we don't value. And so it's a more concrete experience that we're all involved in. Every day we make moral decisions. But ethics is taking a step back from that, being a little bit more abstract. It's more theoretical reflection upon that experience of making moral decisions. So if ethics is thinking about morality, when we look at environmental ethics, we're simply thinking about morality, thinking about moral decision-making in relation to what's good or bad, right and wrong, in relation to the environment, the ecological community of which we are all a part.
When did ethicists and philosophers start to think about environmental concerns? What spurred kind of the development of this field?
Well, if you're looking at ethics and philosophy as a discipline focusing in on environmental ethics, you could make an argument that that's a fairly recent phenomenon. But if you look at ethics and philosophy as something that is part of the human experience, you could really make an argument that indigenous persons for thousands of years have been thinking about how they should relate not only to each other in the human community, but to the larger environmental community of which they are a part. So I like to look at some of the indigenous wisdom in relation to the environment. So some of the really, I think, strong understanding of how we should be relating to the environment can be found in indigenous peoples. But if you're looking more at the discipline of philosophy, you could look in terms of the Western world. You could certainly see that the ancient Greek philosophers were concerned about how they ought to relate to the environment, and they saw that the environment had purpose and value, but the major focus was on the value of human experience, and specifically the value of being able to reason. So if you look at how human beings have seen themselves in relation to the environment, especially in Western philosophy, there's been a fairly dualistic understanding that we are human beings who have the ability to reason, and the rest of the environment is just stuff for us to use. And that's been, I think, a real problem in Western philosophy. And if you look at the history of Western philosophy, that's pretty much how we've viewed nature, as it's an object. It's a commodity. It's stuff that we use. And we, the rational beings, are the ones that have value, intrinsic value, and the rest of nature is just there for us to make use of. But I would say in the 18th century and into the 19th century, in British philosophy, there was a school of thought called utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are probably the two most well-known thinkers in that school of thought. And they began to think differently about how we ought to treat non-human beings. And what they looked at was not whether non-human beings or non-human animals could think or reason. They started to ask the question, isn't it more important that we ask the question, do they feel? Can they suffer? And so they were arguing that we really should be creating a society in which there's the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But they were looking not just the greatest number of human beings, but the greatest number of all sentient beings, all beings that are able to feel. And so Bentham and Mill both believe that it's clear that animals have the ability to feel pain and also feel pleasure. And so that ought to be calculated in our moral decision-making process.
Wow. Is it fair to say that indigenous traditions are more along those lines than our Western classical?
Yeah, I think it's hard to clump them all together because there are so many different indigenous experiences, but there does tend to be a more holistic understanding of human beings in relation to the non-human world and the indigenous understandings than there is in the kind of classical Western philosophy. And then also, of course, in the 20th century and Western philosophy, you get quite a few persons who begin to take very seriously how it is that we ought to treat the environment. And some of this comes from the fact that in the 20th century, especially with global population increasing and the overall impact on the environment that human civilization is having, that leads people to begin to ask, are we doing something wrong in relation to nature? Are we doing something wrong in relation to wilderness? So in the 20th century, you have persons like Aldo Leopold, who wrote the Sand County Almanac, that's really beginning to question our use of nature and our tendency to simply use it as stuff. And then you get persons like Rachel Carson, who look at how it is that many of our chemicals and industrial processes are causing some serious consequences for not only the non-human world, but also the health and safety of human beings. And of course, she looked specifically in her book, Silent Spring, at the effects of DDT on the environment. And then in the United States, I think we can also go back into the 19th century and look at persons like John Muir, who was the founder of the Sierra Club and who really focused on the inherent worth or value of wilderness, which was really important because in Western thought, wilderness was often looked at as wasteland. It's just there, and if we're not using it, if we're not mixing our labor with it, as the philosopher John Locke would say, if we're not making use of it and making it into our property, it's just going to waste. And so wilderness was often undervalued. And John Muir, I think, was one of the thinkers in the United States context, or he was originally from Scotland, but who really said, look, wilderness is something that's important to us. It's something that we ought to value. It's something that enriches the human experience.
Are there aspects of environmental ethics that are really unique among like the broader umbrella of ethics, like we think about business ethics and medical ethics? Are there things that make that the field of environmental ethics particularly unique?
Well, there's a lot of overlap. So when you look at medical ethics, which is thinking about morality in relation to healthcare and our medical system, there's environmental issues related there because our health is very intimately connected to the environment. Human flourishing and human well-being is connected to ecological flourishing. and ecological well-being. And when you look at business ethics, certainly business activity has an impact on the environment. And businesses use aspects of the environment for resources. So there are environmental issues in relation to business ethics and medical ethics. But environmental ethics, unlike those other two areas, is really honing in on our human responsibility for the natural world. And I tend to often refer to it not as the natural world because that makes it seem like it's something that's over against human beings or something separate from us. I like to think of the natural world more as our ecological community.
Which we are a part of.
Exactly.
Okay. I know you've drawn from some really interesting philosophical sources in your work. I've read some of your work and listened to some of your sermons. And I wanted to ask what other philosophical sources that you've drawn from to form your own ethical beliefs about the environment.
Well, personally, I was very much influenced by a school of thought called process philosophy and process theology. It goes back to a British-American philosopher by the name of Alfred North Whitehead, and he taught at Harvard toward the end of his career. And he actually became more of a philosopher in his later years after he was 60 years old. And he, in his system of thought, he focused more on the importance of relationships within the world around us. And he saw the world, the universe, the cosmos, as a web of relationships, more so than a bunch of bits of matter in motion. So unlike Newton and Newtonian physics, which tends to focus more on matter and motion and force, he was looking at reality, the world, as not only being a web of relationships, but entities that experience. So he believed that what we're looking at in the world around us is not objects, but experiencing entities. We as human beings perhaps have some of the most complex experience within that community, but other animals also have forms of experience. And he would argue that there's a kind of experience that's present in the kind of very core of what reality is about. So that emphasis on relationships, that emphasis on human beings being a part of a web of relationships, a community of experience, I think moves us away from the more dualistic understanding of humans versus nature that was such a part of the Western world. And then also I was very influenced by one of his students, actually the student of one of his students, John Cobb, who looked at that concept and applied it to his understanding of Christian theology. So when I was in seminary, I studied the thought of John Cobb and looked at how might it be possible to develop a theology of ecology and to bring the importance of ecological responsibility into our spiritual development and into the Christian church. And during my PhD work, I came under the influence of a school of thought called Boston Personalism, which really focused on the importance of seeing ourselves as being not only persons who are individuals, but persons who are a part of a community. And so Boston Personalism, which was very influential, by the way, on the thought of Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, it's the philosophical school of thought from which he was working in his own work. The Boston Personalists believed no one is an individual. No one is an island. Who we are is intimately connected to the human community of which we are a part, and the human community is intimately connected to the ecological community of which we are a part. So that school of thought, which is not well known today, except usually through the thought of Martin Luther King, also had quite a bit of an influence on me. And it's that school of thought that led Martin Luther King to see the world in such a way where he understood it as being what he called a world house that we all have inherited, and we all have to figure out how we're going to get along in this world house, no matter what cultural background, religious background, ethnicity we have to find some way to live together in peace in this world house. And he identified some, what he called the triple evils within this world house of militarism, poverty, and also racism. And he thought those were the three evils that if we did not address, we could find ourselves not being able to meet the fierce urgency of now of trying to find a way to live together in peace. And I think if he had lived a little bit longer, he probably would have added a fourth evil of ecological devastation.
I definitely want to ask you more later about your work as the director of the World House Institute. But I did want to ask kind of maybe a moral/ethical question. Do you think we have moral obligations that extend beyond those to our fellow human beings? And I wanted to know how we can think about our moral obligations to other living creatures and other species of life.
I think I would agree with Jeremy Bentham, whom I mentioned earlier, who was concerned about the ability of animals to suffer, to feel pain. And when I ask myself, would the world be a better place if there were more suffering or less suffering in the world? I always side with the less suffering. and that less suffering would include less suffering of non-human beings. So all of the things being equal, there may be times when suffering's unavoidable. Suffering's a part of life. But all of the things being equal, if we have a choice between creating the suffering of non-human animals or not, I think it's better to err on the side of caution and not create suffering. Now, that doesn't mean there are times when you need to practice self-defense, or if you're in a situation where there's no other way of providing sustenance for yourself than killing and eating an animal, then that might be a time. But if in other situations, all other things being equal, it's better to have less suffering than more suffering. And so I think we should calculate that ability to feel pain and their ability to feel pleasure. And we've seen from recent studies that animals have very complex emotional lives as well. And so I think we should see animals as having intrinsic value for their own sake, inherent worth. They're not just entities with instrumental value. They have instrumental value. We as human beings also have instrumental value, but they also have inherent worth that we ought to respect for its own sake.
There's another term I've run across in reading a little bit about environmental ethics. Can you talk about the term climate justice? Yeah,
and climate justice, I think, is related to what we would understand as environmental justice. And the idea behind climate justice is that everyone has a right to live in a livable climate, to experience a livable climate. And if we are doing things through human activity that create a situation where the climate is changing and having a detrimental impact on persons and ecosystems, then that's an injustice to those persons and ecosystems. And the reason I connected it to environmental justice in general is that one of the things we know is that when you have climate injustice or environmental injustice, the persons who can least afford to do the things to protect themselves and to not experience the worst consequences of climate change and other environmental problems, they're the ones who experience the worst consequences. And that's often communities where there are persons who have less economic means. And there are a number of thinkers who've talked about environmental racism as well, because if you look at the United States, for example, the places where the most problematic environmental consequences are taking place are areas where you have a larger percentage of people who are people of color.
I wanted to ask you, can you describe some beliefs or traditions under the umbrella of environmental ethics that are in conflict with your own beliefs?
Sure. I'll look at two sides of the spectrum that are on two different sides of me in my position. So on one side of the spectrum, you would have persons who might call themselves environmental ethicists, and they're concerned about the environment, but they're concerned about the environment for purely human-centered reasons, what we would call anthropocentric reasons. And they're not looking at the inherent worth or the intrinsic value of non-human beings. They're looking at how we should relate to the environment, and they're asking, what impact on humanity is our activity going to have in relation to the environment? So they're always asking, how's it going to affect human beings? What's going to be the consequence for humanity? Now, those are important questions to ask. So I'm not against asking those questions. But if that's the only thing we're looking at, if we're only asking the question, what's in it for us, and not asking what's our responsibility for the rest of the ecological community, I think when push comes to shove and we have to make a decision between humanity and the rest of the ecological community, we're almost always going to kind of side with the humanities side of that if we're totally human-centered in our thinking. So although I think it's important to look at those human-centered questions, and also that's a way of getting persons to think about the importance of taking care of the environment when they look at the impact that it has on their own lives. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but I don't think that's enough. I think we need to have a more non-anthropocentric perspective where we look at not only the values of human beings, but the value of all of the life forms in the ecological community. So I have some things in common with that school of thought, but don't think they go far enough. On the other end of the spectrum, there are some environmentalists who tend to be a little bit misanthropic, kind of anti-human. The world would be better off if human beings weren't here. Some of those persons and groups that have those perspectives sometimes use means that I would disagree with, sometimes even violent means to get their point across. And so I'm not someone who's misanthropic. I love human beings. I love the human community, but we do need to find a way to live sustainably within the rest of the ecological community. But I'm certainly not one that would ever advocate for violent means or things that would, in some ways, lead us to lose a part of our humanity as we try to save the world around us.
I did want to ask you, too, about some thinkers have been in the field of environmental ethics have been described as radical, quote unquote radical. They've argued that addressing environmental concerns requires really deep, fundamental changes in all of our attitudes about the world and even our understanding of reality. I wonder where you fall on that continuum. How radical of a change in human beliefs and behaviors do you think is required to address environmental concerns?
I tend to be on the more radical side in relation to that question, which may seem odd given what I just said a few minutes ago. But when I say we need radical change, what I'm really thinking is we need systemic change. We need to not only look at our individual behavior, which is important to do. I mean, we can all use less electricity. We can all drive cars less. We can all fly less. There's all sorts of things we can do as individuals. But if we're only looking at individual behavior, I don't think we're going to get where we need to be quickly enough. You may have heard recently about the climate assessment that related that if we don't deal with climate change in a fairly drastic way in the next 12 years, we're going to miss our window of opportunity to avoid the very worst of climate change. And I think that's probably, from what I have read for many decades now, that's probably an accurate assessment. It's not that the end of the world is going to happen in 2030, but we will have baked into the system so much future warmth from the fact that carbon dioxide is going to be in the atmosphere that we emit. It's going to be in the atmosphere for decades to come, and that's going to continue to warm the atmosphere. And then you have the feedback mechanisms that come into play, the methane being released from the melting permafrost in the Arctic. You start to get a situation where all these things are coming together, and it's going to be very difficult for us to control it. And so I do think, as King said, we're dealing with the fierce urgency of now. We need to make some radical changes, and it's going to be systemic changes that are needed, and we'll need changes in our transportation systems. We'll need changes in our energy systems. We'll also need to think carefully about our economic system. I mean, up to this point, during the age of industrialism and capitalism, growth has been our god. If you have economic growth, that's a good thing. It's always seen as a good thing. And so the primary indicator that we look at to say whether or not an economy is doing well is gross domestic product. If it's going up, things are going well. If it's going down, things are not going well. And we can understand that because when GDP goes down, unemployment goes up, and there's all sorts of issues. But if we're only looking at growth as the indicator of whether or not a society, an economy is healthy, and we're looking at growth in a limited world, in a finite world, and we're just focusing on how can we grow, eventually that's going to catch up with us. If we live in a world of limits, if we live in a finite world, and all we're attempting to do is grow, eventually we're going to grow beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. And I think that's what we're experiencing now. So that's going to take some radical change and a rethinking of some of what have been the kind of fundamental core ways of thinking about our economy.
Thinking about the fundamental shifts that could be required, are there any lessons from history, any times in the past when humans have made a shift of this dramatic nature? Any historical lessons we can pull from the past?
Well, humanity has accomplished some very big things in the past. I mean, one thing would be 10,000 years ago when we moved from being primarily hunter-gatherers to creating an agricultural system that allowed us to move into the kind of human civilization that has developed over the past 10,000 years. And that was a monumental effort. I think in terms of more recent in a more recent context, if you look at during World War II, I think there's a reason why many people like Tom Brokaw have referred to that generation as the greatest generation. I mean, that was an existential threat of Nazi Germany and imperialism in the world that took a tremendous amount of effort, a tremendous amount of sacrifice to overcome. And so that's just one example of when faced with a truly existential threat that could have a global impact, persons were willing to and able to come together in community and make the kind of common sacrifice necessary to deal with that threat. So I don't like to use the language, of war imagery too much, but in a way, we kind of have to be on a similar setting, that we're dealing with an existential threat. We're dealing with something that's going to have a global impact on all forms of life and on human civilization itself. So maybe we can learn something from what it was that motivated and got so many people to do what was needed at a time like that.
Thank you for downloading this episode. If you're on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, Google Play Music, or whatever podcasting library you're listening to this show on, please rate and review. Those reviews and ratings help us tremendously. We thank you.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about another program of Oklahoma Humanities, which is the sponsor of BrainBox. Oklahoma Humanities has a partnership with the Smithsonian Institution called Museum on Main Street that's bringing a traveling exhibit to the state over the next year. The exhibit is called Waterways, and it challenges us to think about all the ways in which water affects our lives. The humanities are all about the human experience, and this exhibit helps us to see how water connects us to nature, spirituality, recreation, and means of production and agriculture. Water affects the ways we live, work, and play. Don't miss your opportunity to dive into the complexity of this vital natural resource. Waterways will tour 5 sites around the state, and it's open now in Norman at the Norman Public Library East. For complete tour information, go to okhumanities.org. So how do you approach the beliefs of people who deny the impact of humans on the environment, or people who are just basically not concerned with environmental ethics at all? How can we engage with individuals across that divide?
It's not easy.
We have a limited time on this podcast.
I think when I was talking about anthropocentrism, the human-centered approach, and I said there are some questions that they're asking and some aspects of their approach that I think are important to look at. I think I would apply that in relation to persons who may not either value the environment for its own sake, or they don't think there's a real big problem in terms of how we're currently relating to the environment. I think talking about, to a certain extent, the impact that it has on them and on their family is an important way of kind of getting into the conversation. I think also most of the things that we need to be doing to relate to the environment in a more positive way over time are actually going to be good for us health-wise, in terms of having a nice, clean environment and a flourishing ecological community in which we can live and be happy and healthy. So, focusing on that, I think, might be a helpful way. And then also, a lot of the stuff will save you money if you do it. If you use less energy, you're going to save money, and that's going to be more money for you and your family, and provide more opportunities. So maybe those are some of the cracks in the window to go through, the cracks in the door to go through, to enter into some conversation where you might find some common ground. And I found this to be the case in churches. So sometimes I consult with churches about what they can do to be more energy efficient and more ecologically responsible. And not everybody's on the same page about what they think about nature and the environment, but everybody's about saving money. Everybody's about doing things that are going to provide more resources for the community so they can do more of the things that are important to them, like the mission of the church. So I think there are ways to interact and talk with persons who might see the environment differently and our impact on the environment differently. But in other areas, it's not so easy. When you're dealing with climate change and what many are calling now the climate crisis, and persons are in a place of deep denial. And look, I would want to deny it too. I don't want there to be climate change. Right. I don't want there to be a climate crisis. And I'd love to believe the people that are saying that there's not a climate crisis. But if you look at the evidence, I'm convinced after looking at it for really decades now that it's just what's happening. And it's difficult to find common ground, have conversations with persons who are in deep denial about that, even though I can understand why they would want to be in that place.
Maybe on the flip side of that question, how can we overcome a sense that addressing climate change is hopeless and the environment is doomed no matter what we do, or maybe that science will just figure it out? Well, we'll all be fine down the road.
Right. There's a tendency for us to often hope that technology will be our savior, that will that no matter what happens, we're going to figure out some way of dealing with this. I think that's some of what we're seeing when we look at geoengineering as one of the ways that's put forward to deal with climate change, that we can actually engineer the planet in such a way that we can address climate change. put some particulates high in the atmosphere to cause some global cooling and things like that.
Or the next step is just colonizing another planet.
There's that. You got Mars. Elon Musk is trying to get us to Mars. Maybe we'll do that as well. So there's and we've had a good track record with technology solving problems. So you can understand why people could think that technology might help us get out of this. And I do think it will help us get out of this. But if we solely rely on technology and don't look at it in a more systemic way, I don't think we're going to be able to deal with it. I'm not in any way hopeless about where we are right now in relation to the environment or the climate crisis, climate change. But I'm not an optimist either. I think we're in a very urgent situation. It's a very critical time. I'm not a pessimist. I'm what you would call a meliorist, someone who believes things can get better, but they're only going to get better if we work very hard together to make them better. And we've waited so long to address the climate change crisis that the kinds of things that we have to do now are more radical than they would have been had we started addressing this when we knew it was happening back in the 1980s. And some people knew it was happening in the 1970s. And so what we're going to have to do now is, we can't just, using a football analogy, we can't just rely on solid ground gains through the line, 3-4 yard gains. We're in a situation where we're in the Bill McKibben uses this analogy. We're in the fourth quarter, 2 or 3 touchdowns behind, not too much time left, and we're going to have to start passing. We're going to start having
Hail Marys.
You want them to be strategic Hail Marys, but we're going to have to get some large gains here pretty quickly. Technology is going to be a part of that, and we do need to do all we can technologically to address the issue. But it's also a change in our way of thinking. It's a change in our spirit. It's a change in the way we do community with each other. That's going to be, looking back, if we're successful, I think we'll look back on it and we'll say that was pretty radical. We had to make a major shift in how we live together in human community to address this crisis.
What are some things that come to mind when we think about how can individuals use environmental ethics in their everyday lives to improve things or make a difference?
Well, there's a number of things that we can do as individuals. And I would say to the listeners, there is an organization called Interfaith Power and Light, and they have a program called Cool Congregations, and they have a tremendous resource. It's 25 things you can do for under $25.
Oh.
And then 25 things you can do for over $25. So you can start with the little things and move towards the big things. And a lot of it's dealing with energy use. A lot of it's dealing with our transportation. A lot of it's dealing with our diet. Because if we as a society were to eat a lot less meat and to grow more of our food locally and not have as much transportation for our food and use less fertilizers and pesticides, that would have a very positive impact on the environment and climate change. So there's a number of very inexpensive things we can do that have a great return, both health-wise and environment-wise. And then after a person does some of those things, you can look at those are the low-hanging fruit. Then we can look at some of the other things that are a little bit more complex that, even though they are more expensive, also oftentimes end up having a payback financially, but also having even a greater impact on the environment. So I think that's not really addressing the issue of how people can think about environmental ethics in relation to the world. I think in relation to that question, we ought to be asking ourselves, how would we want to be treated? We know how we want to be treated. We want our experience to be respected. we don't want people to do harm to us. And we've come to an agreement with each other as human beings that we have duties in relation to other human beings, that we ought not to harm them, that we ought to treat them as ends in themselves and not just means only, as the philosopher Immanuel Kant said. So we've come to this common agreement in relation to human relationships, that we ought to treat each other well, not harm each other, respect each other. And if other life forms also experience and have the ability to feel pain and to suffer, but also to feel pleasure and to have complex emotions, we ought also to be respecting that experience. And we ought not to be doing harm to those life forms unless there's a really good reason to do so.
Huh. I love that answer. Thanks so much for saying that. Perhaps one way individuals can engage with environmental concerns is through something we're doing at Oklahoma Humanities. We sponsor traveling exhibitions from the Smithsonian Institution that explore a variety of aspects of American life and culture. It's a program called Museum on Main Street. And our newest traveling exhibition that we're bringing to Oklahoma is called Waterways. And this is an exhibit that explores many ways that water affects all of our lives. Our guest today, Mark, happens to be the state scholar for this project. And I wanted to ask you, how does this traveling exhibit address aspects of environmental ethics? And what are some of the highlights of this exhibit that visitors might want to check out?
Well, one of the great things about these exhibits with the Smithsonian Institute is you get to have these incredible museum exhibits, Smithsonian caliber exhibits in places around the state that otherwise would not have an opportunity to see these exhibits. And I've had a preview of what this Waterways exhibit is like. It's really going to be a tremendous exhibit in 5 locations around the state. And it looks at how water is a part of our spiritual life, a part of our cultural life, how it is that we use water in our economic and industrial activity, our agricultural activity, how water is a kind of part of our myth, our mythos, and how water plays just a tremendously important role in everything that we do. And if you look at different parts of the world, all of them have stories and narratives and religious and philosophical beliefs about the importance of water. And so this exhibit really helps us to get in touch with that, to hear stories about how water is important to people and to cultures and societies. And also it gives us an opportunity to reflect on our relationship with water in the state of Oklahoma and some of the challenges that we're facing and some of the things that we can celebrate in relation to how we relate to water in Oklahoma. I think we should celebrate the fact that we've been very forward-thinking in Oklahoma in terms of our management of water, in terms of the reservoirs that we've created and the projects we've done to avoid flooding. We've been very forward-thinking. Now, we're experiencing some significant challenges today in relation to flooding in Oklahoma, where areas that should only experience flooding every 500 years are finding themselves sometimes underwater. But Oklahoma, for the most part, has been very forward thinking about that. So we have some time to reflect on that during this Waterways exhibit as well. And then also we're going to be working with the Blue Thumb organization that works with citizens to test the quality of water in our streams and rivers throughout Oklahoma. They're going to be a partner in this Waterways project and have information at each of the different sites as well. So, and there'll be book discussions. There'll be lectures. We're going to have lectures on the ethics of water in Oklahoma as well. So many different ways for people to engage this topic and really have an opportunity to talk about how important water is to our lives.
There's another program that we do at Oklahoma Humanities called Let's Talk About It Oklahoma, which is a reading and discussion series that's held at the libraries and other venues all around the state. And each series is focused on a particular theme. Our newest theme was developed by you, Mark, and it's called Wade in the Water. Can you talk about how some of the readings in this series sort of blend environmental concerns with the world of the humanities?
Yes, and so there's 5 books in the series, and a couple of the books are what you might call science fiction, looking more into the future of what things might be like if we don't address some of the major issues that we have with water, and looking at some of the kinds of conflicts that might arise in the future, especially in areas of the world that are already having significant water shortage, like the desert Southwest in the United States, but also other parts of the world. And then also there are some books in the series that are looking more at what's happening now in terms of our current challenges with water. So, for example, one of the books in the series is titled A Long Walk to Water. It's by Linda Sue Park, and she looks at the stories of 2 11-year-old children who lived a number of decades apart. One is looking in 1985. That's the story of an 11-year-old named Salva in the southern Sudan. And then in 2008, she's looking at the story of a girl named Naya. And they're both in southern Sudan. And she's showing the 2 different experiences that these young children had in relation to the challenge of having adequate access to water. And the child from 1985, Salva, ends up not having adequate access to water in his community. And she writes about all of the problems that causes for his life and for the life of his community and the conflict that creates in that area. And he ended up being a refugee, basically a water refugee because of the lack of access to water. Whereas Naya in 2008 had a very similar situation, did not have adequate access to water, was being extremely limited in what she could do as an 11-year-old because she was responsible for getting the water every day, walking miles and miles to go get the water and bring it back to her family. But in her situation, her community found a way to have good access to water, and it changed everything. Gave her an opportunity to have an education, to have a more stable existence, and it created a community in that village that would never have been possible had they not had adequate access to water. So that's a great story that shows that if you can find a way to solve some of these water access problems in these areas of the world where there's a lot of conflict around water, it can really make a very positive difference. Another book in the series that I'll be presenting on in a few months is called The Activist. It's by Alec Conan, and it's his debut novel. And he's looking at the importance of doing something in relation to our southern oceans, but also all of the marine life in the world in terms of the tremendous stress that human activity is putting on marine life. You may know that the coral reefs in the world are under a tremendous amount of stress. Many of the coral reefs are dying. And we're also putting sharks and dolphins and whales under a tremendous amount of stress. What Alec Conan looks at is it's a fiction story, but he's looking at a young man who's an activist who becomes more and more aware of what we're doing to our oceans, and he decides he wants to do something radical about it, and he joins the Sea Shepherd Society. You may have heard of that show. I think it was on Discovery Channel, Whale Wars.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this character joins the Sea Shepherd Society and goes into the southern oceans to work to try to protect the whales from the whaling fleets that are really going against international law to harvest these whales. But it's a book that really looks at how is it that we ought to be activists, and what's appropriate activism. And because if you've ever seen Whale Wars, they kind of sometimes, some people would argue, cross the line into creating a very dangerous situation. So is that an appropriate way to be an activist, to try to bring about positive change, or does that end up hurting the cause of bringing about awareness and change in relation to the environment? So that's another one of the books, and there's another book. I won't go into great detail, but it's called The Water Knife by Paolo Bacigalupi, and that's looking at the future. Sometime in the future, doesn't give you exact time, but of the desert Southwest in the United States and what might happen if we're in a situation that's kind of a dystopic vision of the future, of what might happen if we have millions of people living in the desert Southwest and not enough water for all of them, and the kind of conflict and violence that could come from that kind of situation. And then there's another book by Kim Stanley Robinson, 40 Signs of Rain, that's looking at a lot of the politics around science and how it is that we might be able to come together to deal with some of the political divisions and the economic pressures that are related to our environmental difficulties. That's also a bit of science fiction, but more focused on a time like today as opposed to out in the future. And then there's another book in the series that is looking at the role of Native American understanding, indigenous understanding of water in their culture. It's called Green Grass Running Water by Thomas King, who's one of the most well-known indigenous authors in North America. And so he's looking at a lot of the myth of water, the importance of water in the Native American narrative and culture.
Well, and listeners can find out more information about the upcoming Waterways exhibit and the Let's Talk About It Oklahoma programs happening near you at okhumanities.org. And we'll put information on the podcast website about the exhibit and about the Wade in the Water theme as well. And you've written an essay that goes along with the Wade in the Water theme, where you write, "Maintaining a livable climate for all life is the greatest challenge not only of our time, but for all time in the history of human civilization on Earth." And just to conclude, I wanted to ask what, if anything, gives you hope when considering the future of how humans will address environmental challenges?
Well, young people are giving me hope right now. I mean, I'm seeing a tremendous amount of energy, passion, and awareness in young people today that really does give me hope that they are seeing the urgency of what we're facing, and they are not shy about letting the rest of us know about that, which I think is very important. And we need to listen. I think they're getting it. I think they're looking at what their future might be if we don't take the steps that we need to take to do something about these great global challenges, both social and ecological. And they're telling the rest of us, if you care about us, if you care about our world, we need to do something. And just sitting around and talking about it and debating about esoteric things is not enough. That we need to actually make some more radical systemic changes. So the one thing that I think is giving me more hope than anything right now is they're getting it and they're standing up for what they think is important and really calling on the rest of us to do what needs to be done.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. We appreciate you coming on the podcast and your work that you're doing for the Museum on Main Street Waterways exhibit and for our reading and discussion program. Really appreciate what you've done for Oklahoma Humanities.
Thank you so much.
Mark, do you want to mention some of the things that are happening with your work?
Yeah, and these are things that are also connected to the Waterways exhibits that are coming up. On August 5th, 2019, I'll be facilitating a discussion on the book A Long Walk to Water by Linda Sue Park, and that'll be at the Norman Library East in Norman, Oklahoma. And one of the things that's really nice about A Long Walk to Water, it's really written for young readers. So this is a great book for kind of cross-generational experience.
Oh, cool.
And then I'll also be leading a discussion on the ethics of water, and that'll be on August 9th at 6 p.m., and that'll also be at Norman Library East in Norman, Oklahoma. And then in November, I'll be facilitating the Let's Talk About It Oklahoma book discussion on The Activist by Alec Connon, and that will be November 12th, 2019 at 5:30 p.m. in the Ada Public Library in Ada, Oklahoma. And then I just also found out this past week that I've been selected to give the FLEER lecture, that's F-L-E-E-R lecture at Central Methodist University, which is in Fayette, Missouri. And they're wanting me to look at the issue of the climate crisis. And the topic that they wanted me to look at is the question of, is it too late? Is it too late? And what are the ethics that we need to have in a time of climate crisis?
Wow. And what an interesting topic.
It is.
Can you talk just a little bit about your work as the director of the World House Institute at OCU?
Sure, yeah. And the World House Institute, you may have already guessed, gets its name from Martin Luther King's World House essay, where he deals with this concept of the World House. And so the World House Institute for Social and Ecological Responsibility was formed about almost 4 years ago now at Oklahoma City University. And it helps oversee the service learning program at Oklahoma City University, where our students take what they're learning in the classroom and apply it through service in a community-based setting and then have an opportunity to reflect academically about it. It also helps promote our ethics minor on campus, and we have ethics lectures and ethics workshops that the World House Institute is a part of as well. And then we have a program called the World House Scholars Program, where students who are interested in issues like peace and nonviolence, social justice, ecological sustainability can take courses in their general education curriculum that really hone in on those topics. And those World House Scholars also have an opportunity, it's part of their scholarship, to have at least one experience in a global context outside of the United States.
Oh, cool. Well, thanks so much for that information.
Sure.
And we'll put some information about that on the website for this episode, too. And again, if you're interested in more information about the Museum on Main Street traveling exhibition or about our reading and discussion program called Let's Talk About It Oklahoma, check out our website at okhumanities.org or email us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. And we encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the Brainbox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/Brainbox website, and on social media by using the hashtag BrainboxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Lauren Nixon, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities or our underwriter. And this has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin. I'd like to take a moment to tell you about another program of Oklahoma Humanities, which is the sponsor of Brainbox. Oklahoma Humanities has a partnership with the Smithsonian Institution called Museum on Main Street that's bringing a traveling exhibit to the state over the next year. The exhibit is called Waterways, and it challenges us to think about all the ways in which water affects our lives. The humanities are all about the human experience, and this exhibit helps us to see how water connects us to nature, spirituality, recreation, and means of production and agriculture. Water affects the ways we live, work, and play. Don't miss your opportunity to dive into the complexity of this vital natural resource. Waterways will tour 5 sites around the state, and it's open now in Norman at the Norman Public Library East. For complete tour information, go to okhumanities.org.